name is Jacob Wright. I'm a professor at Emory University. I'm sitting here in my office, and I have the pleasure and honor of introducing our speaker today, Professor John Day, a name that will be known to most of you. And John is a colleague of mine who is very illustrious. He's a widely published author, has a dozen books and hundreds of articles, and has done so much over the years for the field. And he is a scholar. He really spends time in the library researching down to the most every jot and tittle, they say. He crosses them. And he's now working on Genesis 1 through 11. I've been talking to him a bit about that, trying to, so much that has not been done that he's going to reveal to us through that commentary. But today he's going to speak on Job and suffering. And it seems to be always relevant, but perhaps even more relevant in our world right now. So take it away, John, Professor Day, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Jacob. The title of this lecture is The Book of Job and Innocent Suffering. Now, the Book of Job is widely appreciated as a great piece of literature, one that struggles with a perennial theological problem, the problem of innocent suffering. But for centuries, people have argued, and continue to argue, about what exactly the Book of Job is trying to say. There are also other disputed questions about the book, such as, is it a unity? Is it a wisdom book? And so on. With regard to the first question, with which I shall start, Job and innocent suffering, I feel that a multifaceted approach is necessary, as different parts of the book emphasize different points. I shall first go through the different parts of the book in order, exploring what I think they say. First, suffering as a test of the genuineness of Job's piety. In the prose prologue, chapters 1 to 2, with which the book starts, we are introduced to the figure of Job, who is righteous and wealthy, and lives in the land of Uz, or Hebrew Uz, and he's said to be the greatest of the people of the East. The Satan, and it is the Satan, not simply Satan, the Satan cynically tells God that Job is only pious because it pays him to be so. So a wager takes place between God and the Satan to test the genuineness of God's piety. As a consequence, Job is deprived of his possessions and children, and subsequently afflicted with a terrible skin disease. But still, Job maintains his piety, humbly accepting his lot, and refusing to follow his wife's suggestion that he curse God and die. At the end of the prologue, we read that 3 of Job's friends come to console him. They are Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. And we read that they sit together in silence for 7 days. Presumably they're so silent because they're so appalled by Job's terrible condition after his suffering. So we might say that the message of the prologue is that we should love God for himself, not simply for what we can get out of him. Suffering can be a test of faith, and this is something particularly emphasized in Islam, for whom Job is called Ayub. Next, the dialogue. Innocent suffering is real. Next, we have a poetic dialogue between Job and his friends, which takes up much of the book. Overall, an important purpose of the book, I think, is to argue that there is such a thing as innocent suffering. This may seem obvious to us today, but was apparently not the case in ancient Israel to all people. As many as 30 chapters of the book, the so-called dialogue section, chapters 3 to 31, about 2/3 of the book, consist of a poetic dialogue between Job and his 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Here they endlessly discuss, repeating many of the same arguments time and time again, about whether Job's terrible suffering is because he is a notorious sinner, as the friends say, or whether he is suffering completely unjustly in view of his virtuous character, as Job claims. We, the readers, know from the prose prologue that Job is a perfectly righteous man, and this is confirmed by the prose epilogue, where Yahweh confirms that the friends have not spoken what is right, unlike Job. Now, in the dialogue section, this begins in chapter 3 with Job cursing the day of his birth. This is more of a monologue than a dialogue in this chapter. And this echoes Jeremiah 20, verses 14 to 18, where Jeremiah laments the day of his birth in similar terms. And Job seems to be later than Jeremiah, so it's probably based on Jeremiah here. And Job wishes that he had never been born. Subsequently, the three comforters, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, take it in turn to debate with Job, and Job responds to each one by one. But there is no meeting of minds here at all, as Job insists on the basis of his own experience that God has become his enemy and is punishing him unfairly, and that he has not done anything to merit the terrible suffering that has come upon him. In contrast, the three comforters, so-called, make a dogmatic appeal to tradition to justify their view that Job's terrible suffering must be the result of his sin. And they feel that he is blaspheming by speaking of God in the way that he does. He should repent, and then all will be well. The tradition to which the comforters appeal is the earlier wisdom tradition, found, for example, in the book of Proverbs, which repeatedly gives the impression that the righteous are rewarded and the wicked punished. Zophar even goes so far as to assert that Job is suffering less than his guilt deserves. Job 11, verse 6, while Eliphaz makes a whole series of false allegations about Job in chapter 22, making him sound a real rascal. And here I will quote some of the text. Eliphaz says to Job, "Is not your wickedness great? There is no end to your iniquities, for you have exacted pledges from your family for no reason, and stripped the naked of their clothing. You have given no water to the weary to drink, and you have withheld bread from the hungry. The powerful possess the land, and the favoured live in it. You have sent widows away empty-handed, and the arms of the orphans you have crushed." Now, with friends like that, you might think, who needs enemies? And Job seems to agree with that, saying of them that they are miserable comforters, all of you, Job 16, verse 2. As part of Job's last outburst, chapters 29 to 31, Job outlines in 31 all the good things he has done by way of care for the needy, and this appears to reply to Eliphaz's criticisms of Job just cited above. At the same time, in this context, Job asks to be weighed in a just balance, and this recalls the weighing of the heart in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, chapter 125. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, of course, it's afterlife, not in this life, as in Job, but the dead person recites all their good deeds, rather like Job 31, and asks to be weighed in a just balance. And you find the same imagery in the book of Proverbs. So that's that. Next three, suffering as a mystery beyond human understanding. In chapters 38, after 30 chapters of dialogue between Job and his comforters, God himself suddenly appears on the scene out of the whirlwind and delivers two speeches to Job. The first speech in particular is quite majestic. "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." So it starts off and goes on to taunt Job for his ignorance of various aspects of the universe. But whereas chapter 38 focuses on the physical universe, chapter 39 concentrates on the wonders of the animal world that God has created and whose mysteries are likewise beyond Job's understanding. In the second divine speech, in chapters 40 to 41, God asks Job if he can overcome two terrible monsters, Behemoth and Leviathan, whose physical characteristics are spelled out in detail. But who exactly are Behemoth and Leviathan? If you look at most Job commentaries, They will tell you that they are the hippopotamus and crocodile, respectively. This view goes back to Samuel Bochar's 1863 book, Herozoikon, which means sacred zoology. However, I'm sure this view is wrong. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, including Job, Leviathan is the name of a mythical sea serpent or dragon. And this is consonant with the fact that Job 41, verses 19 to 20, declares that Leviathan breathes out fire and smoke. Now, when have you seen a crocodile breathe out fire and smoke? You haven't. This is clearly a description of a dragon. Ultimately, Leviathan goes back to Canaanite mythology, as we know from the Ugaritic texts. Now, interestingly, and this is a point I discovered when I wrote my first book, God's Conflict with the Dragon and the Sea. No one else seems to have previously noticed this. In the Ugaritic texts, Leviathan has a companion who is a mythical sea ox. And this, I suggest, is the origin of the figure of Behemoth, whose name means great ox and lives in the water. Now, scholars have argued about what exactly the precise point of the second speech is. But to me, the answer is clear. Since the answer to God's question, can you overcome these creatures, is obviously no, Job cannot overcome these monsters, the implication is, how much less can Job hope to overcome God in argument? That this is actually the point of the speech is supported by the fact that Job says to God immediately afterwards, I know that you can do all things. That means including overcoming Behemoth and Leviathan. In a similar way, the first divine speech is pointing out that God is God and humans are human. And there are things beyond our puny human minds too mysterious for us to fathom. How much less, therefore, can we hope to fathom the mystery of innocent suffering? You see, the divine speech is nowhere directly mentioned innocent suffering, but unless we're to claim that God's speeches are totally irrelevant, we have to see some point in them. And I think he's making the point that there are things beyond human ability to fathom and understand, and so on. My fourth point is that God finds God in his suffering. So this brings us naturally to our fourth point about the contribution of the book of Job to the problem of innocent suffering. For H. Rowley, a scholar of a former generation, this was the supreme point that the book of Job makes, namely that Job was able to find God in his suffering. Rowley called this a practical religious solution to the problem of suffering rather than a theological solution. And this relates to Job's words to God in Job 42 verse 5, following the two divine speeches, where he says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Up until the two divine speeches in which God appeared to Job out of a whirlwind, chapters 38 to 41, Job had been hoping that he could see God and be vindicated. This is supremely the case in the famous words of Job 19 verses 25 following, that begin, I know that my Redeemer lives. I'm reminded of a former Bishop of Birmingham and President of the Modern Churchmen's Union, Leonard Wilson, who, while Bishop of Singapore during the Second World War, was repeatedly terribly tortured by the Japanese. But Wilson claimed that he was more conscious of the divine presence, of the presence of God, at that moment of torturing than at any other point in the whole of his life. Some of his torturers were amazingly converted to Christianity because of his forbearance in suffering. So that's God, finding God in suffering. And the fifth point I think the book is trying to make about suffering is that God puts things right in the end. At the end of the book, in Job 42, verses 7 to 17, we have a prose epilogue, which balances the prose prologue at the beginning. In the epilogue, Job is restored to health and wealth and gets his family and possessions back. Theologically, this is the author's way of saying that God puts things right in the end. So there are clear limits to the author's rejection of the act-consequence relationship. Job is restored to his former happy situation because the test of his piety set out in the prologue is now deemed to be over. However, while God puts things right, this is not in an afterlife, but in this world. But subsequent to the book of Job, the belief in a meaningful afterlife belief did develop in Judaism in apocalyptic. First of all, in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, written during the Maccabean crisis in the 2nd century BCE. And a more meaningful afterlife belief appears to be already found a little bit earlier in the Wisdom Psalms 49, verse 15 and 73, verse 24. But some scholars have claimed that Job does express belief in his vindication in an afterlife in the famous passage in Job 19, verses 25 to 27, best known from the alto aria in Handel's oratorio, The Messiah. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, then in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see on my side and not another. We can, however, be sure, I think, that this passage was not originally referring to vindication in an afterlife, but rather in this world. This is because in the book of Job, elsewhere, Job accepts the traditional belief in Sheol, that everyone goes to a rather shadowy underworld after death. And only 5 chapters earlier, in chapter 14, he has explicitly rejected the possibility of resurrection. Thus in Job 14 we read, "There is hope for a tree if it is cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its shoots will not cease. But mortals die and are laid low. Humans expire, and where are they? As waters fail from a lake and a river wastes away and dries up, so mortals lie down and do not rise again. Until the heavens are no more, they will not awake or be roused out of their sleep." Now, so far as I can see, there's no reason why Job would suddenly change his mind in the course of 5 chapters. Nobody changes their minds in the dialogue section in this book. So it seems most unlikely that Job expresses an afterlife belief, even though this has been a traditional belief amongst many people. What Job is hoping for here is vindication in this life. And this view also has the advantage that it is precisely what does happen later in the book, when God appears to Job and then restores him to what his life had been before his suffering. So he is vindicated in this world. I next come on to a discussion of the question of the unity of the book of Job. Various scholars have thought that different parts of the book might be later additions. So what are we to say about this? First of all, there's the question of the unity of the prologue and epilogue on the one hand, and the dialogue and divine speeches on the other. Indeed, one cannot help but be struck by the difference between Job in the prologue and epilogue on the one hand, and in the poetic sections on the other. In the prologue, Job is patient, humble and uncomplaining about his lot, whereas in the dialogue, he is impatient and full of complaints. Again, in the epilogue, God declares that Job has spoken what is right, unlike the 3 comforters, whereas in the divine speeches, we get the clear impression that God is rebuking Job about something, and this is immediately followed by Job's repentance in Job 42, verses 3 to 6. So how are we to explain this? Most scholars accept that the author of Job has taken up an old folk tale in the prologue and epilogue and used it as a framework for his own more creative work in the poetic sections, and I think this is correct. This could explain the tension that exists between the prose and poetic parts of the book. But the author of the main part of the book presumably had a way of reconciling the 2 parts of the book. The change in Job's attitude to his suffering in the dialogue section he might perhaps have explained as attributable to character development, partly provoked by the unsympathetic response of the so-called comforters. And the contrast between God's rebuke of Job in the divine speeches and commendation of Job in the epilogue can be explained as one scholar put it as follows, I think. He said, "The condemnation and commendation are not on the same point. Job is condemned for presuming to pass judgment on things beyond his understanding, and for the rash things he has said after his misfortunes has come upon him. He's not actually being condemned on the issue in which he is being tried, namely whether he is a righteous human being or deserves his punishment. Incidentally, with regard to Job the patient, in the letter of James in the New Testament, which is the nearest the New Testament comes to having a wisdom book, I think, the author declares in chapter 5, verse 11, "You have heard of the patience of Job." Now, for those who have read the dialogue section of the book of Job, this was come as a bit of a surprise, since there Job appears distinctly impatient in his complaints about his suffering. This has even led one scholar to wonder whether the author of Job hadn't read beyond Job chapter 2. However, I think it's more likely that Job had in mind a pseudepigraphical work known as the Testament of Job, which is generally dated to the 1st century BCE or CE, and this is a rewriting of the book of Job that very much emphasizes Job's patience or endurance, hupomene in Greek, in the face of his suffering. And this same Greek word hupomene is what is used in James. Interestingly, it is also the steadfastness of Job in the face of trial that dominates Islamic thinking about Job. And perhaps I should say, I just used the word pseudepigraphical. The Testament of Job is a part of the pseudepigrapha. Some of you may wonder, what do we mean by the pseudepigrapha? Well, I used to tell students it's Jewish books that were too apocryphal to get into the apocryphal. Get the joke? They were too apocryphal to get into the apocryphal. Next, with regard to unity, is the question of the Elihu speeches, chapter 32 to 37. Suddenly in chapter 32, after Job's last outburst in chapters 29 to 31, a new guy appears on the scene called Elihu. We haven't heard of him before. As the text says, he was angry at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He was also angry at Job's 3 friends because they had found no answer to Job. Job has in fact been called the first angry young man in world literature. He says that he has kept quiet until this point while the older and what presumably wiser men were speaking, but now finally feels he must speak out. Like the other 3 friends, Elihu thinks Job is in the wrong, and on occasion even repeats the very same words as the comforters. However, he adds the additional point that Job's suffering could be disciplinary rather than simply retributive, Job 36 verse 15. And in his final 1 1/3 chapters, from Job 36:24 to Job 37:24, Elihu anticipates God's first speech in emphasizing God's great power manifested in the wonders of creation. Most modern scholars rightly regard the speeches of Elihu as a later addition, since he is not mentioned elsewhere in the book and no one responds to his speeches. The omission is particularly striking in the epilogue, where God says nothing about Elihu at all, although he commends Job and condemns the 3 other comforters. Moreover, the divine speeches in chapters 38 to 41 are clearly addressed to Job, although in the text, as we now have it, Elihu is the one who has just been speaking. It should also be pointed out that there are more Aramaisms in the Elihu speeches than elsewhere in the book, and this too suggests a later origin. As the post-exilic period went on, more and more Jews were speaking Aramaic rather than Hebrew, so if we get more Aramaisms in the Elihu speeches, it fits if they're later. So altogether, I think a very strong case can be made that the Elihu speeches were added by a later editor who had read the rest of the book before him, had the rest of the book before him, but was unhappy with it as it stood. Next, with regard to the wisdom, there's the question of the so-called wisdom speech in chapter 28. This is also widely regarded as a later addition by many scholars. It's a speech about wisdom, hence its name, the wisdom speech. This is a beautiful, brilliantly written piece about the inscrutable nature of wisdom. It starts by saying that people know where to extract precious metals from a mine, but they don't know where to find wisdom. This chapter concludes with the words, "Truly the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil, that is understanding." As it stands, the chapter appears as part of the words of Job. but they are singularly inappropriate on his lips, since they are so remarkably calm in spirit, in contrast to Job's speeches elsewhere, including his immediately following outburst in chapters 29 to 31. But the calm words of the wisdom speech are also inappropriate on the lips of any of the comforters, whose words are similarly so full of passion. Nor am I persuaded by the proposal of David Kleins and Ed Greenstein that they constitute the finale of Elihu's speeches. To adopt this view, you have to move chapter 28 from its current position to after chapter 37, and there's no textual evidence at all for that. And I don't think the sentiments of Job 28 are all that similar to anything that Elihu has said in his speeches. So the wisdom speech is best regarded as a later addition to the text, I think, though it is not impossible that they come from the main author of the book. Now, the last thing regarding unity I'm going to discuss is the second divine speech. God has two speeches, and the second one goes from Job 40 verse 25 to 41 verse 3 to 33 in the English translation. They're different in the Hebrew. Many scholars think that the second divine speech is a later addition. Why, they feel, does God need two speeches when God has already conceded after the first one? However, we should note that Job is only silenced after the first speech. He does not repent till after the second one. Moreover, I would say, if Job and his friends are allowed 3 rounds of speeches, why should God be limited to one? This author seems to enjoy going on and on about things, so it seems quite natural God should have 2 speeches. Again, and this is a point that I've noted myself, I haven't seen anyone else spot it, the divine speeches in Job 38 following are in part a reflection of the creation Psalm 104. And this Psalm 104, towards its end, makes a reference to God playing with Leviathan in verse 26. So God's asking Job if he can play with Leviathan in Job 41 verse 5, that's the English verse numbering, must be dependent on that, in effect supporting the authenticity of the second divine speech. So you see, what we have said about Leviathan in the second divine speech is it all belongs together with many of the things that the first divine speech has taken up from Job, from Psalm 104. Other critical questions I shall now discuss. First, the date and language of the book. When speaking of the date of the book of Job, we have to distinguish between the date at which the book was written and the date at which the story is set. As for the setting of the book, this is clearly in early times. Job himself offers sacrifice, not needing a priest. And the word kasitar for await, Job 42 verse 11, and NRSV translate piece of money. This term is elsewhere found in Genesis 33 verse 19. Further, the name Eliphaz occurs as a descendant of Esau in Genesis 36:15, and it's closely mentioned in connection with Teman, an area in Edom. So this, I think, explains the origin of the figure of Elihu the Temanite. He's been thought up from Genesis 36 verse 15. And in the same verse, in the Hebrew Masoretic text, we have a fellow called Zepho, and I think this figure may well lie behind Zophar. Indeed, the Septuagint actually calls him Zophar, not Zepho. There's obviously a confusion between the Hebrew resh and the Hebrew vav, whichever was original there. And finally, Job's length of life in Job 42, 140 years, tallies with the kind of lifespan attributed to the patriarchal figures in the book of Genesis. So everything suggests the work is set in patriarchal times. The language of the prose prologue and epilogue, however, strongly supports a post-exilic date, a Second Temple date, perhaps about 450 BCE. It can be shown that these chapters tend to use later rather than earlier Hebrew forms of expression. However, the biblical Hebrew use is not the very latest, but still a bit on the late side, so suggesting a post-exilic date. As for the Hebrew of the dialogue section, this is rather peculiar and contains many hapax legomena, that is, rare words occurring only once. It has even been suggested by the great scholar Jonas Greenfield that it is written in an Edomite dialect so as to fit in with the characters speaking. I feel this is possible, but a bit speculative, since we have so little by way of Edomite literature actually to compare it with. We just have a few inscriptions. But though the book was certainly written in the post-exilic period, it is clear that an older tradition lies behind it. This is shown by the fact that even before our book was written, we have an allusion to the figure of Job in the book of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 14 and 20. And if we believe the dating, this is somewhere between the first exile of 597 and the second exile of 586 BCE. So about 590 BCE. Here the prophet declares that if Noah, Daniel and Job were in the land, they would deliver only their own lives by their righteousness. So clearly, already in the 6th century BCE, Ezekiel was aware of a righteous figure called Job. Whether this person actually ever existed, we cannot say for sure. There may or may not have been a historical Job, but what we can say is that the details of the story and the speeches that we have in the book are a literary construct. Next question, is the book of Job a wisdom book? The book of Job has commonly been regarded as a wisdom book. But in recent years, some scholars have questioned whether this is an accurate description. And some have even questioned the very existence of a distinct genre of wisdom literature. Some scholars now just say this is a modern scholarly construct. The other books commonly deemed as wisdom literature include Proverb and Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, in the Hebrew Bible, and Ecclesiasticus, also called Ben Sira, and the Wisdom of Solomon in the Apocrypha. These are all examples of didactic literature, and it seems to me very reasonable to describe them all as wisdom books. The Wisdom of Solomon, after all, has wisdom in its very title, and Ben Sira has the subtitle, The Wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach. Further, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, were attributed to Solomon, who is noted for his wisdom, rightly or wrongly, in 1 Kings. As I've said, wisdom books are didactic in nature, didactic literature. They are supposedly written by wise men, and they give advice on how to live a good life. But what of the book of Job? Is this a wisdom book or not? In form, it is quite different from the other works mentioned, as it largely consists of a dialogue between Job and his friends. And unusually, God also makes a appearance on the scene, and that's, unparalleled in wisdom literature, God appearing on the scene. So in form, it is quite different from the other books deemed to be wisdom books. However, there are various indications throughout the book that suggest that Job and his friends see themselves as wise men. Compare Job 15 verse 2 and 32 verse 7. And there is much mention of wisdom in the book. Look at Job 4 verse 21, 11 verse 6, Job chapter 12 verses 12 to 13, and Job 13 verses 5 and 15, and on it goes. And the discussion in the book centers on the question of retribution and the act-consequence relationship, something central to the book of Proverbs. Job's comforters can be seen as representing, I think, the traditional wisdom expressed in Proverbs, that the righteous are rewarded and the wicked punished, while Job repeatedly declares this to be untrue in the light of his own personal experience. Interestingly, the words found in both Proverbs 13 verse 9 and 24 verse 20, that, and I quote, "the lamp of the wicked will be put out," end of quote. These words are actually quoted by Bildad, one of the comforters, in Job 18 verses 5 to 6, only to be questioned by Job in Job 21 verse 17, where Job declares, "How often is the lamp of the wicked put out?" So it seems that a large part of the book of Job consists of a discussion between wise men about the reality of the act-consequence relationship, so central to Proverbs as it concerns Job. So does this mean that we should call Job an anti-wisdom book? I think not, since Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes, which questions the act-consequence relationship even more radically than Job, still counts as a wisdom book, as its attribution to Solomon and didactic characters show. Moreover, the book of Job has in common with the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes the belief in God as creator in central to its theology, and totally lacks allusion to such things as Yahweh's mighty acts in history or the covenant, which we find quite a lot of in many other parts of the Hebrew Bible. So my conclusion to this section will be that Job is a wisdom book, not in the sense that it conveys wisdom instruction like the others, but rather that it is a dialogue between wise men and manifests much of the general wisdom ethos. Next, I discuss the ancient Near Eastern background of Job quite briefly. Interestingly, the problem of innocent suffering does not appear to have caused much of a theological problem in ancient Egypt, and this has been attributed to the traditional fatalism of the Egyptians, as well as the very strong Egyptian belief in immortality. In Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq, however, we find several poems about the righteous sufferer. Most commonly compared with Job is the work often called the Babylonian Job, or in Akkadian, Ludlul Baal Namaki, I shall praise the Lord of wisdom. In this poem, the sufferer is a righteous king and ultimately restored by his god Marduk. In crying to his god for deliverance from his suffering, the Mesopotamian Job cannot think what he has done wrong to bring on his suffering. But unlike Job, he is prepared to believe that maybe he has done something wrong to offend the deity, even if he doesn't know what it is. My last section is called, How Could Job Be an Edomite? The international character of wisdom literature is reflected in the fact that both Job and his so-called comforters are all foreigners, non-Israelites. Job is described at the very beginning of the book as dwelling in the land of Uz or Uts, Job 1 verse 1. Where was that? Well, in Lamentations 4 verse 21, Edom is said to be in the land of Uz. And similarly, Uz is including among the descendants of Esau, that is Edom, in Job 36 verse 28. We may therefore safely conclude that Job was an Edomite, an inhabitant of southern Transjordan, perhaps somewhere not so far from Petra, where all the tourists go. Tamar was a region in Edom. Again, Bildad the Shuhite is from Shuach in Midian, mentioned in Genesis 25 verse 2, and Midian was next door to Edom. With regard to Zophar the Naamathite, we do not know where Naamathite refers to exactly, but as I've already said, in Genesis 36 verses 11 and 15, a descendant of Esau is called Zepho, and the Septuagint actually calls him Zophar, reading Resh for Vav at the end of the name. So Zophar too could well be an Edomite. Like Bildad, Elihu the Buzite was also from northern Arabian area, specifically from Baz or Boots, mentioned in Assyrian inscriptions as somewhere in northern Arabia. Now, this is my last paragraph. There are several references in the Hebrew Bible which indicate that the Edomites were noted for their wisdom. Obadiah verse 8 and Jeremiah 49 verse 7. So one might speculate that an old Edomite story lies ultimately behind our book, even though the author of the work as we have it was clearly a Jew. Think of all the references to Yahweh and so on. However, it is particularly striking that Job should be the hero of a Jewish book written in the post-exilic period, written in the Second Temple period. For it was in the post-exilic period that Edomites were particularly hated in Judah, seemingly because of the Edomites taking advantage of Judah and gloating over the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586 BC. We see this if you look at Lamentations 4 verse 21, Psalm 137 verse 7, the whole book of Obadiah, it's only one chapter long, and Malachi 1 verses 2 to 4. What has been actually called a damn Edom theology pervaded the Jews at one time, as one particular scholar put it. So how was it possible, I would like to ask, for an Edomite to be the hero of a Jewish book written at this very time where Edomites were so castigated? Well, I actually wrote an article about this in the 1990s, and I suggested 4 possible reasons, which I will briefly mention here. First, maybe the tradition that Job was an Edomite was so strong that it couldn't be avoided. That's one possibility. Secondly, wisdom was universalistic, as I've said earlier, and the wise had fewer hang-ups about foreigners than other Jews at that time. Thirdly, Job is depicted as a Yahweh worshipper, so could be regarded as a good guy, perhaps. He worshipped Yahweh. Fourthly and finally, the story of Job is set in distant patriarchal times, long before the Edomites were sworn enemies of the Jews. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that. That's very informative, and it's really masterfully done in terms of how much you've covered,
Yeah.
how many issues you've addressed, and succinctly, but also clearly and helpfully. It was a wonderful talk, Professor Day. Thanks for engaging us so honestly and forthrightly.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and thank you, Jacob, for chairing. I must let you now rush off to your meeting. I gather you've got in a few minutes' time.
This
So
is the
thank you very
final
much.
session of the year, and we will meet again next year.
Yeah.
Thanks to Thea.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
And thank you to Thea. Yeah. Goodbye.